Henry Ashford here, and I'd like you to picture this. A group of baffled English officials standing proudly beside their brand new gleaming warship, while handing the keys, so to speak, over to a gang of pirates, who are probably trying very hard to look respectable while suppressing giggles. This is not a rejected Monty Python sketch. This is history. If that image makes you smile, go ahead and like this video, leave me a comment about what silly name you'd give your own pirate warship, and subscribe for more tales of history's most spectacular lapses in judgment. Now, the year was the early 1620s, and England was in one of its favourite historical moods, broke but ambitious. They had just built what was supposed to be a shining symbol of naval might, but the royal pockets were turned out and empty. So, in the kind of financial logic that has fueled empires for centuries, they decided to make a little quick cash by quietly selling off this vessel. The buyers, unfortunately for everyone in Britain, were not some harmless collectors looking for a conversation-starting lawn ornament. They were highly motivated pirates, delighted to step into their new role as the worst possible second-hand owners in maritime history. So there it was, this proud new flagship of English engineering, bristling with guns, polished wood gleaming, flags stitched with all the pomp the royal seamstresses could manage, and being handed, with something very close to ceremony, to men whose previous ship had most recently been described in official records as an inadequate lawn ornament with sails. It turns out that when the Crown needed cash, discretion was not a priority. They did not advertise the sale in the classifieds, but they might as well have, because the people who turned up as buyers were the maritime equivalent of a wolf showing up to adopt sheep. And here lies the problem. The pirates who purchased the ship were not just any old cutthroat rabble. They were organised, motivated, and not remotely interested in sailing quietly into retirement. They had just been gifted the maritime equivalent of a dragon, and they were already thinking about how to take it for a ride through someone else's village. To understand just how ludicrous this was, imagine England at the time. Streets filled with mud, people busy debating over whether bathing more than once a month counted as dangerous extravagance, politics as stable as a one-legged stool. And into this backdrop rolls the latest symbol of national pride, constructed with all the expense and craftsmanship the Treasury could barely afford. And yet, faster than a poorly built Tudor chair collapsing beneath a dinner guest, this ship passed into the hands of people who, until yesterday, were eating rats roasted over driftwood. It is a little like pawning off the family crown jewels and watching them instantly reappear being worn by the burglars robbing your neighbour. But England convinced itself it was fine because, at least for a fleeting moment, the kingdom had a few extra coins clinking in the royal purse. We should pause for a moment here to appreciate the ship itself. This was not some dinky fishing boat you could imagine pulled up beside a wharf while a bored fisherman complained about cod prices. This was a proper warship designed to stop enemies in their tracks with a forest of cannons and that daunting presence that only comes from something too large to exist for any practical reason. The vessel was brand new, ornate, and deeply intimidating. The kind of ship that would make any respectable admiral breathe a sigh of relief upon seeing it sail under his own flag. One can almost picture the first merchant faced with it under a pirate flag, surprised to find his sense of national security suddenly rearranged into pure panic. As first impressions go, this must have been spectacularly unpleasant. The pirates themselves were not the cartoonish cutthroats you imagine stumbling about with parrots and endless mugs of ale. They were more like entrepreneurs of chaos, clever enough to realise what had just fallen into their lap. These were Algerian corsairs, veterans of fast raids across the Mediterranean, suddenly in possession of a top-tier English warship they had absolutely no business owning. One might think England would enforce rules to keep this sort of thing from happening, like perhaps not selling state-of-the-art naval craft on the open market. But then, this was 17th century England, which often confused national strategy with rummage sales. And so the pirates sailed off, probably with great joy, while London officials congratulated themselves on what they thought was prudent financial management. The central conflict, if we can generously call it that, was now fully set. The very vessel meant to protect Britain's seas was about to become its worst nightmare. Merchants who days earlier toasted the Royal Navy's strength quickly discovered their protector had turned into their predator. Reports began to spread of a ship bristling with guns, crewed by pirates who were enjoying the sort of upgrade that made every raid feel like cheating at a board game. It was humiliation distilled into nautical form, and the irony hung heavy in the air, like the smell of damp wool in a London alley. The English crown had tried to save pennies, and in the process had armed the very enemies who would spend the next few years gleefully demanding pounds in the form of plunder from their own subjects. In retrospect, it would be tempting to suggest that someone in a high office should have seen this coming. On the other hand, hindsight is always easier when you're not the one staring at an empty treasury and wondering if selling off a warship is really that different from selling old chairs out of the palace basement. But history is made of such cheerful blunders, gifts that keep on giving, and out on the sea the pirates were more than happy to demonstrate exactly what England had sold to them, and for anyone keeping count, the score was about to get very lopsided indeed. To understand how this maritime disaster came gift-wrapped in royal ribbon, we need to step back to the world of early 17th century England, a world where the streets were cobbled with ambition and frequently with manure, where the monarch wore lace collars roughly the size of parasols, and where religious tension and budget shortfalls competed neck and neck for the title of most likely to cause a war. This was the reign of King James I, and later his son Charles, a pair of monarchs with towering aspirations and wallets that could not quite keep up. England at this time fancied itself a great naval power, even while struggling to pay the sailors. The result was a military philosophy that can best be described as lavish idealism, tightly fastened to helpless improvisation, with the fiscal discipline of a man attempting to retire by cashing in half a lottery ticket. The Mediterranean Sea during this era might be mistaken for a particularly aggressive chessboard, only with more blood and less rule following. The Ottoman Empire controlled enormous swathes of coastline, their influence extending westward like a well-organized shadow, while European powers squabbled with one another about trade rights, papal authority, and whether Protestantism was more heresy or headache. Caught up in all of this were the Barbary states, semi-autonomous North African territories nominally under Ottoman authority, but in practice running something rather more entrepreneurial. Chief among them was Algiers. Their economy thrived on corsairing, a term which sounds dashing but translates mostly into clever piracy, bolstered by political winks and a surprisingly tidy tax structure. It was a brisk, well-oiled operation. Think start-up culture, but with sabres and a fleet of fast-moving ships named things like the Honest Turk and the Swift Prophet. These Algerian corsairs didn't just plunder at random. They operated under detailed legal charters known as letters of marque, issued by local rulers who cheerfully washed their hands of the consequences. As long as the spoils made their way home and the right palms were greased, they could sail out and raid with impunity. They were not uncivilized brutes, but professionals, just very enthusiastic ones. Many of them were converts from Christianity, Europeans who'd been captured or defected, known as renegades. These were people who had decided that life aboard a corsair ship, sailing under the Algerian flag with a generous cut of the profits, looked greatly preferable to their previous careers as underpaid fishermen or overpaid Jesuits. And here is where the absurdity properly heats up. England, for all its imperial ambitions, had very little real control over what happened along the Barbary coast. They issued outraged diplomatic letters whenever a British merchant vessel was taken, and occasionally dispatched warships to make stern faces at the horizon. But these gestures carried about as much authority as a pigeon flapping at a lion. What England did have, on paper at least, was an unofficial policy of appeasement, salted with a few backroom treaties and ransoms paid under complex euphemisms like gifts or expressions of goodwill. Some years it worked. Other years it worked about as well as placing a doily over a cannon and hoping for the best. Meanwhile, England's financial situation was moving from disastrous into the realm of interpretive art. Parliament and the monarchy were stuck in one of those long constitutional stalemates that could only have been solved by giving everyone involved a biscuit and a nap. With military expenditures ballooning and income failing to keep pace, the Crown found itself in an increasingly creative relationship with its own navy. Ships were commissioned with fanfare and later decommissioned with mumbled shame. The records from the Admiralty during this period read less like military planning and more like desperate improvisation. That the best warship in the fleet would be sold to foreign buyers, known corsairs no less, was not so much a betrayal as it was a budgetary shrug. Now, one might imagine that even in such circumstances checks would exist. Perhaps a basic quiz. Are you intending to use this ship to improve Anglo-Mediterranean relations, or to board English cargo vessels and ransom their passengers? But the system was fuzzier than that. The buyers often came forward with middlemen or ambiguous paperwork, and no clerk in London seems to have asked too many questions. This is likely because the only thing standing between the sale and complete collapse of naval payroll that month was the optimistic tick of an ink-dipped quill. There was plenty of suspicion, yes, but far more bills than answers. It was hardly the first time a grand idea had been quietly sacrificed on the altar of escalating national oops. So off the ship went, christened in full British pride, and quickly reimagined as a pirate flagship in the service of men who had spent the past decade exploiting the vulnerabilities of European coastal traffic with almost poetic efficiency. The trio of Algerian corsair captains who took possession were well known to British authorities, though usually as problematic names listed in increasingly frantic diplomatic dispatches. To them, the new ship was not just useful, it was absurdly generous. It was as though the enemy had sent them a siege weapon with a ribbon attached and a helpful instruction manual pointing out every weak spot in the coastal defences. And the really fascinating part? The ship had not yet even reached the height of its infamy. The corsairs, delighted by their fortune, wasted no time. Within months of purchase they had rebranded the vessel under a new name, loaded it with their finest crewmen, many of whom spoke enough English to mock their victims in increasingly offensive puns, and set sail for a stunning tour of British merchant shame. Insurance rates for English cargo suddenly became astronomical, assuming you could find a syndicate brave enough to offer them, captains began sailing under false flags, hoping to pass unnoticed. Some resorted to throwing their own cargo overboard at the first sign of trouble. Better to ruin a voyage than be caught offering the enemy a complimentary delivery service. And still, back in London, the official narrative tried to maintain a dignified silence. This sail was an oversight. The subsequent piratical exploits were regrettable. No one officially had seen it coming, even though nearly everyone acquainted with naval planning had shouted about it for months. The East India Company, usually composed of men who would cheerfully tax their mothers if it boosted quarterly revenues, sent letters in every shade of barely contained panic. Coastal governors, those poor souls trying to protect rickety trade outposts with even ricketier defences, began asking whether perhaps the real pirates were the ones with expense accounts and confounding procurement decisions. By the end of the first year, the ship had become legendary. Children in coastal villages sang nervous songs about it. Captains cursed its silhouette from miles away. Diplomats whispered about it in corridors lined with enough oil paintings to create a small defensive wall. And the pirates, they painted it, polished it, and sailed it with all the joy of a child handed the keys to a very expensive toy store during a clearance sale with no supervision whatsoever. In a way, they were almost grateful to England for the gift. As one later account from a captured sailor read, they seemed genuinely confused that no one had tried to stop them, or at the very least ask for a receipt. Let us drift here for a moment. Just imagine the sound of that ship's sails creaking as it glided through moonlit waves, elegant and ominous, carrying with it all the wrong flags and all the right firepower. It was England's finest ship, defending English shipping lanes from the wrong side. There would, of course, be consequences, but for now the dragons were flying free, and no one seemed quite ready to admit who had forgotten to lock the treasure chest. The real trouble began, as it so often does, with a committee. Specifically the Subcommittee for Foreign Maritime Transactions, a hastily formed body composed mostly of well-powdered aristocrats who knew almost nothing about the sea and even less about foreign policy. Their role, ostensibly, was to oversee naval equipment sales to ensure national security. In practice, they met in a draughty room with too few chairs and debated whether a ship's hull could be considered diplomatic property. These debates were rarely productive, though they were excellent excuses for extended sherry breaks. One member, Lord Fulworthy of Devon-on-Hemp, once argued that a cannon was not weaponry if it had never been used. The minutes from that meeting were accidentally preserved in full, and they include the sentence, "Let the record show that Lord Fulworthy believes intention and ballast are spiritually incompatible." Meanwhile, rumours of the rogue warship's exploits had begun circulating among court musicians, who put them to music in what can only be generously described as heavily editorialised sea shanties. One particularly popular tune, sung in alehouses throughout Portsmouth, referred to the ship as the Queen's Mistress, which did unfortunate things to the national mood. Listeners assumed it either referred to the ship's betrayal or to a scandal involving the monarch's romantic preferences, both interpretations causing no small degree of diplomatic wincing. Church authorities attempted to ban the song, which only ensured it surged to number 1 on the semi-apocryphal Puritan Top 40. As English merchants filed complaints en masse, another strange phenomenon arose. The pirates, realizing their ship was both feared and famously British, began receiving letters. Yes, letters. Written by bribed informants bitter sea captains and at least one hopeful playwright. Some were requests for safe passage, others proposed extremely flexible contracts. One poet offered to compose an epic celebrating the corsairs as misunderstood sea philosophers if they would agree not to burn down his cousin's spice warehouse in Kent. The pirates, amused, reportedly kept these letters in a carved cedar chest and read them aloud during meals. It was, by many accounts, their version of after-dinner theatre. Back in Whitehall, desperation was growing at a pace previously reserved for plague years and weddings involving distant cousins. The Duke of Middleshire, a professional uncle and part-time naval advisor, proposed a cunning plan to buy the ship back. This suggestion, for its sheer optimism, was briefly considered until someone pointed out that the Crown couldn't afford a new set of fleet maps, let alone reacquire stolen prestige. The King's Treasurer was last seen muttering into his wig about phantom ships and ghost budgets, which, while not technically helpful, did get turned into a popular tavern drink involving rum and regret. Even the Barbary diplomats, usually confined to polite lies and cautious pleasantries, began to lose their composure. The English ambassador to Algiers, Sir Horace Underbridge, attempted to negotiate the ship's return using the subtle threat of being very disappointed. According to his own diary, the discussion ended when his Algerian counterpart offered him a cup of mint tea and changed the subject to horticulture. Sir Horace later described the moment as an elegant refusal buttressed by floral conversation and absolute indifference. Meanwhile, among the pirates themselves, a curious form of hierarchy began to emerge. The captain of the ship, a former Venetian accountant named Yusuf the Unrelenting, instituted twice-weekly inspections to ensure the vessel remained in what he called metric British condition. Sailors caught hanging laundry from the rigging or failing to dust the ornamental cannons were reprimanded sternly, sometimes with poetry. He was particularly insistent that the ship's brass fittings be polished with a vinegar solution, not because it worked better, but because it respected the original chemical balance of the craft. Many of the crew found this insistence baffling, but were too rich to care. On the shores of Marseille, meanwhile, things took a slightly decorative turn. A minor French duke, inspired by tales of the renegade British ship and its elegant lines, commissioned a tapestry. He wanted it to show the ship in the act of pursuing terrified merchant vessels past an exploding cargo of Dutch cheeses. The artist, who had never seen a ship, constructed an ambitious but ultimately bizarre image that resembled a particularly violent teapot with sails. No one corrected him. The tapestry now hangs in a regional museum, where it is admired for its commitment to boldly fictional maritime realism. In an effort to counter the embarrassment, England began launching retaliatory missions. These were less successful than hoped. One ship, HMS Persistence, ran aground after mistaking a sandbar for a hostile vessel. Crew accounts suggest there was a debate over whether sand counted as a form of water aggression. Another patrol mistimed their departure and ended up stuck in fog for 3 days, during which they accidentally blockaded a friendly fishing village and confiscated 80 barrels of pickled herring before realizing the mistake. In their haste to return, they left a cannon behind as an apology. The village elders now use it as a bench. Back in court, King Charles attempted to redirect attention by commissioning new naval uniforms. These were made of an unfortunate wool blend that looked rather smart but caused most sailors to develop early onset heat rashes and a lifelong suspicion of anything described as regal beige. The uniforms were quietly discontinued after 2 years, though one was later repurposed as a gift to the ambassador from Savoy, who wore it backwards out of polite confusion. This was still considered a diplomatic success, mostly because no one fainted. As the seasons turned, the ship, still defiantly flying its hybrid flags of British craftsmanship and rampant piracy, continued its reign. It slipped between coasts like a gossip in high society, never quite staying long, but always leaving a scandal in its wake. Portuguese officials began whispering it might be cursed. Spanish merchants offered prayers to St. Elmo, and in at least one documented case, hired Catholic exorcists to bless the cargo. The Vatican, when asked for comment, simply shrugged and said that only so many miracles could be allocated per fiscal quarter. And all through this, the original builders of the ship, a proud but increasingly confused dockyard crew from Deptford, began receiving letters of admiration. Most were unsigned, penned in a variety of scrawling hands and languages, complimenting the craftsmanship, the tight-turning radius, and the sheer audacity of the paintwork. Some included small drawings. One featured an elaborate doodle of the ship chasing the moon, with the caption, "Thank you for the most excellent nightmare." Eventually a proposal surfaced from an especially well-paid Scottish merchant, who suggested that if the pirates were this competent, perhaps they should be hired by the Crown outright. He called it a reverse conquest diplomacy initiative, and even offered to draft the contract in rhyming couplets. The idea was rejected narrowly, though not before generating a heated debate in Parliament about whether morality or effectiveness should govern foreign policy. The answer, it seemed, was neither. And so the ship sailed on, a floating contradiction, a perfect specimen of British engineering, piloted by men declared enemies of the Crown, funded in part by the very treasuries it raided. It was, in essence, the most successful piece of government property never to pay a tax or attend a meeting. Somewhere out there, past the headlands and embroidered maps, it drifted beneath stars that could not quite believe what they were seeing. The sea, after all, holds many secrets, but this one had official paperwork. Word of the ship's uncanny resemblance to a Royal Navy vessel spread quickly, mostly because it was, in fact, a Royal Navy vessel. Watching it sail into harbour with pirate flags was unsettling, in the same way you'd feel if your neighbour's cat stole your identity and began applying for bank loans. It was even more confusing for British port officials, who often saluted the ship automatically out of habit, only to realise too late that it was currently looting the dockyard biscuit stores. This led to the brief but memorable biscuit panic of 1626, during which several officials were reprimanded for assisting in their own pillaging. The pirates, for their part, were not born fools. They quickly learned to dress in uniforms almost indistinguishable from the real navies, except for tiny flourishes that revealed a certain flair, the exaggerated plumes in their hats, for instance, or the unsettling number of embroidered pineapples on their lapels. One particularly enthusiastic pirate insisted on being called Commodore Raisinhead, despite no one ever learning why, possibly not even him. Still, their nautical performance was so convincing that official records briefly listed them as a royal detachment stationed somewhere near Gibraltar. That detachment later received a commendation for defending British trade routes from themselves. Meanwhile, back in London, the Admiralty struggled to understand why reports of attacks always described the enemy vessel in such admiring technical detail. One senior clerk noted that the hull dimensions matched exactly those found in the Crown's own specifications, which led to a month-long investigation into whether someone had started copying warships out of spite. No one thought to check the original sales receipt, which had been written on the back of a dinner menu from an inn in Dover, then used to wrap herring. As pirate raids increased, coastal towns became jumpier than a squirrel in a thunderstorm. Some communities tried to placate the pirates with gifts, leading to the brief fashion of erecting statues made entirely of salted fish. One town put up a wooden effigy of the pirate captain, carved entirely from driftwood and wearing an actual crown they borrowed from the local vicar's collection of pageant props. The pirates were both flattered and confused. They accepted the tribute, then stole the town's entire annual supply of rope, a fair trade by 17th century standards. A side character now shuffled into the story. His name was Elias Wren, a former royal cooper who had been dismissed from the navy for producing barrels that were unusually prone to rolling uphill. Elias harboured a quiet grudge against mathematical plausibility, and had since taken to selling fishing hats with inspirational quotes stitched into the brim. When the pirate vessel happened to dock near his shack, Elias offered them a set of barrels he swore were perfect for holding both rum and mysterious tension. The pirates, taken with Elias's single tooth and general air of chaotic dignity, hired him on the spot. This would prove to be a mistake in at least 3 directions. On board, Elias immediately set to work converting the captain's quarters into what he called a spiritual fermentation station. This involved placing oddly marked barrels in feng shui positions and replacing the ship's compass with a jar of pickled onions. Navigation suffered. So did morale. But mysteriously, their raids became even more successful, as if the universe itself wanted them to be just a little bit ridiculous. One captured merchant swore he'd surrendered partly out of confusion after watching the pirate ship signal for parley by waving a portrait of Queen Elizabeth while playing a hurdy-gurdy duet on deck. To avoid recognition, the pirates periodically repainted the ship, each time selecting a more unconvincing cover identity. It was briefly labelled the Herring Surprise, then the Dutch Delight, then the Very Legal Ship. At one point, it bore the name the Tax Inspector. For a week, this paint scheme created absolute chaos, with 3 British frigates turning themselves in to avoid potential audit. One captain, inexperienced but deeply anxious about paperwork, surrendered twice. It was around this time that whispers began spreading about a ghostly vessel bedecked in contradictory flags, and crewed by men who argued over tea blends during battles. Sailors called it the Harlequin of the Sea. Questions about its origin were met with various theories, including sea curses, French illusionists, and a seagull-based love triangle. But beneath the jokes, a real sense of fear began to settle in. A ship that could be anywhere, attack anyone, and plausibly claim to be doing so in the Crown's name was a rare kind of maritime horror, the kind with good branding and confused ethics. Back in Parliament, attempts were made to address the issue. A proposal to rebuy the ship was raised and then immediately discarded when someone pointed out they had no idea where it was. A second proposal, to build a look-alike vessel in hopes it would cancel out the original in some symphonic balance of naval karma, was only vetoed because the budget had already been promised to new horse armour for the Duke of Windlesham. The Duke had requested armour that made his horse look more philosophical, something with furrowed leather eyebrows and a belt of contemplation. News of the rogue vessel reached international ears as well. Spanish merchants began carrying maps with wide red zones marked "Don't Go Here," and the Dutch started gluing small prayer flags to their masts in hopes of divine confusion. Even the Ottoman navy grew concerned when they briefly mistook the ship for one of their own experimental flute barges, which had been discontinued after the unfortunate incident involving goats and powdered sugar. Still, the pirates were undeterred, maybe even inspired. With each passing month they grew bolder. They began hosting impromptu maritime theatre productions using captured sailors as both audience and cast. One such performance, a loose adaptation of Julius Caesar reimagined as fishmongers in love, was noted in 3 separate logbooks as being bafflingly beautiful. The ship's cook wept openly. It later turned out he was weeping over the wasted onions. And so this curious chapter of naval entanglement spun on, a story that no one quite understood but many were caught in. A floating contradiction, sold by accident, dressed with intention, and sailed with far more flamboyance than anyone had budgeted for. Where it would go next, and who it might impersonate in the process, was anyone's guess. But back in a quiet archive room in London, a junior clerk named Marjorie Booth began to notice something odd. Every time the ship struck again, the date coincided with a biscuit requisition form approved with a curious seal, a pineapple perched atop crossed cutlasses. She made a note in the margin, then politely asked for a transfer to the Coastal Lighthouse Service, where one's absurdities arrived by ship rather than inter-office memo. Once the pirates had their new toy, a sleek oak-planked monstrosity with more guns than good sense, they wasted no time in putting her to use. She was rechristened with a name too obscene to translate politely, so most historians simply refer to her as the Problem. The Problem sailed along the English coast with the lazy swagger of someone who knows nobody can stop them and has brought snacks just to make the boasting more comfortable. By the spring of 1624, the Problem had already harassed 7 merchant convoys, 3 customs patrols, and at least 1 ceremonial wedding barge, which turned out to be neither armed nor politically prepared for such an interruption. Back in London, government officials were slowly starting to realise that perhaps selling advanced warships to anonymous clients bearing sacks of coins and suspiciously goat-scented letters of introduction had been, in strategic terms, what one might call a tactical whoopsie. The Lord High Treasurer commissioned an inquiry, which mostly involved asking each other who was supposed to check the buyer's credentials, while also carefully trying to avoid being that person themselves. According to the minutes from the resulting committee, which were inked with alarming amounts of wine stain, the consensus diagnosis was, quote, a misalignment of priorities during the transaction approval workflow. In simpler terms, someone got distracted by a pheasant. Meanwhile, the pirates were thriving. Crime, like topiary or amateur taxidermy, rewards confidence and careful planning. The Problem was captained by one Adriana de la Rosa, a Spaniard of Andalusian birth and extremely inconsistent biography. Depending on which source you believe, she was either the illegitimate daughter of a disgraced noble or an accomplished falconer turned privateer after a hawk-related argument got out of hand at court. What is clear is that she ran a tight ship, insisted on daily violin practice among the crew, and once refused to fire on a vessel flying a tartan flag because she liked the pattern. The rest of Europe began referring to her as La Capitana del Caos, which when whispered late at night sounds poetic, but can also be translated as the Lady Captain of Terrible Ideas. The British Crown, humiliated yet stubborn, decided to quietly put together a task force to recover the Problem. Unfortunately, due to budget constraints and the utter absence of competent volunteers, the mission was entrusted to Sir Colin Likebridge, a minor noble with major allergies and no real sea experience, whose primary qualification was having once seen a ship from a distance while on a picnic. Sir Colin embarked from Portsmouth with 3 ships, 8 barrels of pickles, and a dog named Professor Buttons, who had an unfortunate habit of barking every time the compass pointed south. Things deteriorated rapidly somewhere near Normandy when Sir Colin attempted to signal a merchant vessel by releasing confetti and waving his hat, which in pirate code means declare war. The merchant ship fled quite sensibly, and Professor Buttons jumped overboard in what several crew members described as a deliberate act of protest. Morale was low, but supplies were lower, and within 2 weeks the task force had become functionally lost and recreationally mutinous. An unnamed midshipman reportedly drew a map of their situation titled "Probably Hell," adding a small flag that simply said, "Here be regret." All the while, the problem continued its victorious joyride up the English Channel, now stopping occasionally to mail ransom notes that included recipes for tomato chutney, possibly as a taunt, or perhaps because Adriana was genuinely proud of her culinary side projects. She had, it turns out, begun training a small group of captured English sailors in the finer points of Mediterranean cuisine. At one point, a ship raided off the Cornish coast was left untouched apart from a generous helping of very good fish stew, and an apologetic letter explaining that this was just for practice, nothing personal. Back in court, the King, James I, still ruling optimistically despite being disliked by most furniture makers of the era for his confusing taste in chairs, was starting to lose patience. He wanted the problem handled, preferably quickly and without involving Parliament, for reasons that mostly included avoiding more speeches about fiscal prudence. Unfortunately, his next plan was to offer clemency to the pirates in exchange for their services fighting off other pirates, a scheme which had already failed spectacularly 3 times and once resulted in the accidental knighting of a parrot. Yet even as the royal mind unravelled from lack of good counsel and indoor smoking habits, the situation continued to spiral outward. By summer, the problem had formed an informal alliance with 2 other rogue ships, one French, one Dutch, both captained by people named Jacques, and for several weeks they acted as a sort of travelling concert troupe that occasionally also did crimes. Contemporary letters describe seeing these ships sailing together at dawn, violin music drifting across the water, with flags spelling phrases like "make trade weird again" and "loot gently." It was during this odd period that Adriana began issuing her own version of currency, small wooden tokens with seashells glued to one side and crude portraits of seagulls on the other. Naturally, scholars now refer to these as chaos notes. A bewildering number of these have been recovered in taverns across the Low Countries. Apparently they were accepted as legal tender, provided one was buying only alcohol and only from establishments with no stairs. Reports from coastal towns began to shift in tone. Where once there were cries of outrage, now there were grumbles of resigned admiration. It was difficult to stay angry at a ship that would steal your goods, sing you a song, and then leave you a jar of olives. Children began pretending to be the problem in their street games, sometimes even demanding a ransom from passing ducks. During an official inquiry into public opinion, one farmer from Sussex said he did not see the issue as long as she left the cows alone and continued sending those delightful lemon cakes. None of this escaped the notice of the Dutch East India Company, who had developed a reputation for being extremely interested in money and almost morbidly curious about anything that interfered with it. They sent an emissary, one Johannes Muck, who arrived wearing shoes so polished they reflected inconvenient truths. Muck approached the problem directly, rowing out toward her under a flag of truce and holding a long scroll of what he claimed were terms. Adriana interrupted him halfway through by teaching him how to play the lute, and somehow, by the time Muck returned to Amsterdam, he had agreed to sponsor a charitable fund for wayward musicians who also happened to have cutlasses. And so, odd threads began to converge in the tapestry of this very nautical nightmare. A stolen warship, several nations embarrassed in stereo, a nobleman who still believed he could negotiate with wind direction, and a pirate captain who might have accidentally founded the first floating food cooperative. It was less a war on piracy, and more a bureaucratic acceptance that they had been beaten at their own game by someone with better deserts. The question, shifting slowly into darker waters, was what such a symbol of failure could become if left unchecked. After all, history teaches us that ships can be decommissioned, but legends tend to go wherever they like, especially legends with recipes. The first signs that things had truly gotten out of hand appeared in late autumn of 1628, when reports reached London of a suspiciously familiar-looking warship loitering off the coast of Cornwall. According to furious merchants and at least one extremely confused lighthouse keeper named Godfrey, the ship had hoisted what appeared to be a weather-beaten skull and crossbones sewn from old tobacco sacks, and was demanding that passing vessels deliver a tribute of rum and marmalade. Godfrey, who had worked the same lighthouse since the days when ships still used rowers, reportedly tried to negotiate with the pirates using semaphore and a rather expressive hat. It did not work. The British Admiralty, caught between mild embarrassment and outright panic, dispatched a small fleet to intercept the vessel. This might have gone better if they had not, in something approaching divine irony, sent two older ships that had been designed by the same architect as the pirate one. The ensuing naval chase felt more like a family reunion hosted by a drunk uncle with a grudge. The pirates, knowing every creek and blind spot of the warship they now commanded, absconded effortlessly, vanishing into the channel with a farewell shot that removed the weather vane from a coastal church in Devon. It was later recovered and reinstalled backwards. Back in London, chaos blossomed with the unsettling grace of a dandelion in a manuscript library. Parliament convened an emergency committee on naval affairs, which managed to achieve precisely nothing but the appointment of Sir Tristram Fernby, an elderly gentleman with a walrus moustache and no sea experience, as acting overseer of North Atlantic pirate suppression. Sir Tristram's first public statement included the phrase, "Certain pirates may be merely misunderstood entrepreneurs," which did not do wonders for public morale. Meanwhile, the pirates, whose ranks had now swelled with Flemish deserters, disgruntled Scottish whalers, and one former town crier known only as Hubert the Loud, began treating their stolen warship as a kind of floating diplomatic embassy of absurdity. They sent letters to port authorities written in elaborate rhyming couplets, offered bribes in the form of intricately carved turnips, and once delivered a crate of squealing piglets labelled for the royal treasury. The pigs escaped and lived for several happy months in the Tower of London's moat, which remained pig-scented until at least 1634. At sea, things became no less theatrical. The pirates painted elaborate murals on the sides of the ship. One memorable design depicted King James clumsily riding a haddock, and added a decorative cannonball rack shaped like a reclining Cupid. their newly hired cook, a former pastry chef named Eliza McThistle, insisted on preparing full high tea every afternoon regardless of incoming storms or naval engagements. On one dramatic occasion, she served scones and clotted cream while a boarding party exchanged crossbow fire with the Dutch. No one knows who won that battle, but the lemon curd was exceptional. Efforts to reclaim the ship took an increasingly unhinged tone. A northern magistrate suggested disguising a smaller vessel as a floating brothel to lure the pirates in. The plan was nearly approved until a cleric protested on grounds of moral confusion. An aristocratic lord in Kent proposed building a duplicate warship and challenging the pirate one to a formal duel at dawn. His fellow peers vetoed the idea only after someone pointed out that ships, unlike gentlemen, could not fire pistols at 10 paces. Also, the cost in gunpowder alone would bankrupt the wool tax. The pirates, having heard through their extensive grapevine of merchants and tavern gossips that a hunt was on, began leaving whimsical calling cards after each raid. These took the form of small boxes containing limericks, a slice of salted eel, and in one mysterious instance 4 left shoes. No explanation followed. The right shoes were never found, which unsettled the Irish coast for months. Word of the pirate empire, and let us now finally call it that, with its own hierarchy, unwritten constitution, and seasonal pudding contests, soon reached foreign courts. The French were deeply amused. The Spanish were deeply annoyed. The Dutch, in a characteristically pragmatic diplomatic gesture, sent the pirates a bouquet of tulips and recommended better sails. The pirates responded with a politely worded thank you note and an unsolicited zucchini. Inside the warship, things took an operatic turn. The pirates elected a commodore by competitive pie-eating contest and instated a shipboard currency based entirely on the aesthetic value of the barnacles collected from enemy hulls. The ship's figurehead, originally a proud lion of England, was replaced with an inexplicably detailed carving of a disgruntled goose. Sailors fed it breadcrumbs for good luck before attacks. Several swore it hissed with divine approval. As winter approached, the Royal Navy found itself inadvertently supplying the pirates with more resources. On at least 3 occasions, British supply ships mistook the pirate warship for an escort and obediently delivered cargo ranging from powdered wigs to salted beef. One shipment included several barrels of ceremonial wigs intended for a Lord Mayor's installation. The pirates held a formal ball using these wigs, playing music with borrowed harpsichords and debating whether anyone truly understood the correct way to use a salad fork. Eventually, a nervous envoy from the British court attempted to parley with the pirates under a flag of truce. He was invited aboard, treated to a generous brunch, and returned unharmed except for the fact that his boots had been replaced with turnips. He considered this a minor dignity loss compared to previous diplomatic failures, and recommended redrawing the maritime borders to avoid further incidents. His proposal was filed in a drawer labelled Miscellaneous Disasters. Back in London, poets grew inspired. One minor bard, a Mr. Alistair Fogg, temporarily famous for his epic concerning 2 dogs and a fishwife, wrote an allegorical ballad comparing the warship debacle to the fall of Rome, and somewhat less convincingly to the making of cheese. The court, citing national security and aesthetic confusion, banned the poem. Several copies survived nonetheless, lovingly hidden in salted herring barrels and recited in taverns during exceptionally dull Wednesdays. As spring of 1629 crept in with its unreliable breezes and sudden squalls, the pirate warship had become a kind of mythic object. Children in coastal villages claimed to hear its sails flapping like angry curtains in their dreams. Scottish monks recorded its sightings in their footnotes next to accounts of miraculous wells and shrieking owls. The Vatican issued no official statement but adjusted its navigational maps to include a small drawing of a frowning duck. And through all this, the pirate crew sailed on, their stolen warship somehow repaired, re-armoured, and slightly elongated due to an accidental shipyard mix-up in Flanders. No one was quite sure how a warship could be elongated without sinking, but then again, no one had been quite sure how pirates had managed to outwit 3 separate navies using only wit, deception, and 12 aggressively trained parrots, especially the one named Archbishop Clawsworth. But by now, of course, the situation had begun to exceed even the scope of traditional maritime nonsense. The news that a prized English warship was now in the employ of pirates spread not so much like wildfire as like a very confused gossip session at a poorly attended tea party. By the time it reached London, details had been added, omitted, or entirely reimagined. Some said the pirates had renamed the ship the Floating Devil. Others claimed it went by the Honourable Mistake. For a brief 4 days in early June, the Admiralty believed the vessel had spontaneously sunk out of embarrassment. It had not. It was in fact parked ostentatiously in the harbour of Salé, flying a hand-sewn flag that appeared to depict a fish drinking wine. In an attempt to undo the growing scandal, the English government did what it generally did in times of maritime confusion. It created a committee. This particular committee was chaired by Sir Lionel Butterworth, a man best known for once surviving an hour-long duel by accidentally falling asleep. Sir Lionel's first order of business was to write a stern letter of inquiry to the pirates, hoping perhaps that diplomacy, delivered by post, might shame them into returning the ship. It did not. The pirates, upon receiving the letter, used it to settle a rocking table in their council room. Meanwhile, the ship itself was thriving in a way that only a stolen state-of-the-art warship in the hands of ambitious criminals could. Her cannons were now polished twice weekly, her sails repaired with painstaking care, and her galley was staffed by no fewer than 2 former Venetian pastry chefs who saw piracy as a step sideways in their careers. The crew had instituted mandatory calisthenics and began painting motivational phrases in crude Arabic on the walls of the lower decks, none of which translated quite correctly. One just said, approximately, "We will gently punch the sky." Back in England, merchant companies began petitioning Parliament for protection against what they diplomatically referred to as the "our boat" problem. Shipping lanes had become unpredictable. The pirates, thanks to their absurdly excellent vessel, could take what they wanted and vanish over the horizon before anyone could even shout appropriately. One convoy was overtaken mid-journey and forced to perform a play about maritime taxes for their captors. Reviews were mixed. One of the more curious effects of this chaos was the sudden emergence of a figure named Elias Pennybroke. Elias was a minor clerk in the Navy Office who had, for the last 8 years, been painstakingly documenting non-existent ships in hopes of receiving bonus pay for vessels that did not exist and therefore could not sink. He arrived at a meeting of senior officials with blueprints for 3 fictional brigs and a 4th, more ambitious schooner named the Justifiable Expense. Instead of being arrested, Elias was promoted and asked if he could draw one that could fly. As the situation at sea grew steadily more surreal, the pirates themselves discovered an unexpected downside to operating a military-grade warship: paperwork. The ship had come with a full logbook, a parcel of navigation charts, and a list of detailed refit schedules which now had to be either followed or ignored at one's peril. The pirate quartermaster, Ahmed Al-Fassi, spent entire afternoons debating whether they ought to observe the recommended stern castle maintenance interval. In the end, they did. After all, legacy serves no one if your rudder housing collapses under stress. Back in Salé, a kind of pirate bureaucracy began to take root. Earnings were now distributed with receipts. Arguments over loot required mediation and half-hearted legal code translations. Someone even proposed building a dry dock. By September, the ship had hosted a wedding, 3 duels, and a municipal election for dockmaster, which was won by a 7-year-old boy after he promised unlimited pickled lemons. Naturally, the French began watching all this with the kind of vague curiosity one reserves for a neighbour's overly decorated Christmas display. They were amused, then concerned, and then quietly interested in possibly purchasing their own deeply humiliated English vessel. Diplomatic feelers were sent. The English, mortified to realise that the entire affair was becoming a competitive embarrassment, issued a royal decree forbidding the sale of warships to any individuals, or, for clarity, pirates, even if they had good references. Things took an even stranger turn when a group of English sailors, having heard rumours about the exceptional pastries served on board the rogue vessel, defected. They rowed out under cover of night and offered their services in exchange for cinnamon tarts. The pirates, after some discussion, hired them on a 3-week trial basis. One of them, a man known as Thomas the Goose due to permanent neck indentations caused by poorly adjusted armour, was later promoted to morale officer. His primary duty was to tell stories with the exact right number of lies to keep expectations both high and elastic. And so, the ship that had once been the crowning achievement of British naval ambition became, for a brief window of time, an independent floating theatre of commerce, cuisine, petty crime, and near-bureaucratic excellence. It terrorised no fewer than 5 coastal settlements, but always with flourish and a touch of flair. In one notable incident, they invaded a small port in the Algarve, kidnapped the local mayor, forced him to judge a ship decorating contest, and then returned him with a fruit basket and a certificate of thanks. The English government, upon receiving word of this through an increasingly exhausted network of informants, decided it was best to pretend it had all been part of a clever plan. A memorandum was circulated explaining that the sale of the warship had been an experimental destabilization tactic to study enemy response times. The memorandum contained 7 pages of vaguely nautical language and ended with the phrase "victory by indirect attrition," which satisfied precisely no one but convinced them all to move on. But not everyone moved on so easily. A merchant named Horace Puddleton, who had lost 3 shipments of wool, began an obsessive letter-writing campaign to the Crown, the Admiralty, the East India Company, and at one point a travelling puppet troupe he suspected of harbouring fugitives. His letters increased in number and volume until, at their peak, he was dispatching 17 per week, each sealed with a wax stamp depicting a weeping sheep. What he lacked in influence, he made up for in relentless emotional distress. And somewhere off the coast of North Africa, that stately English warship, now slightly more patchwork than perfect, sailed on under its flag of the fish and wine. Its figurehead had been modified to resemble a reclining man holding a spoon, and below decks the pastry chefs had begun experimenting with saffron. The crew, when not engaged in acts of maritime hostility, practiced sea shanties about inventory management, and argued about whether the ship should install a second coffee grinder. And so, just as England attempted to forget the whole affair, the ship remained defiantly afloat, somehow more organised and more cordially piratical than ever. Things grew quieter after the first few months of piracy, if only because the Royal Navy became suddenly and profoundly preoccupied with pretending nothing had happened. The ship, now rechristened with a name that sounded exotic and vaguely threatening, something like the Vengeful Olive, although the historical documents are oddly inconsistent, vanished into thick fog somewhere near the Azores. At least that was the official story. The Navy insisted loudly on its own ignorance, while privately dispatching 2 undercrewed brigs and 1 unusually enthusiastic cartographer to find it. They returned several weeks later with a hand-drawn map, 50 feet of stolen anchor chain, and a goat named Admiral Shivers. None of these recovered items were considered answers. Meanwhile, the pirates, now flush with success and heavy artillery, began taking themselves somewhat seriously. They formed a sort of committee, held meetings in the captain's quarters, and began assigning titles. The man previously known as Left Hand Tom promoted himself to Minister of Gunpowder Storage, though he was the only one with any surviving fingers, which may have influenced his win in a disputed ballot. A Dutchman named Cornelis, whose loyalties were vague and whose boots smelled permanently of onions, was placed in charge of diplomatic affairs. He successfully negotiated a 1-week alliance with the Tunisian privateer crew in exchange for a crate of mahogany scrap and what turned out to be a wooden leg filled with olives. Not the metaphorical kind, actual pickled olives in brine, unpitted. British merchants, meanwhile, were facing the logistical shock of discovering that their maritime insurance premiums now forbade travel within sight of their own coastline. Some ships were rerouting as far as Iceland to avoid English waters entirely. One proud East India Company vessel spent 27 days circling the Isle of Man, unsure whether heading to port in Liverpool would result in trade or theft of their entire stern. The captain misplaced his logbook in frustration, accidentally recording every entry on the back of a cheese manifest. Several bureaucrats tried to make sense of it, and 2 resigned. Back on the high seas, the pirate crew's cohesion was beginning to fray under the burden of unexpected success. When stealing merchant cargo, they began to grow picky. One argument broke out over whether it was beneath their station to plunder a shipment of hairbrushes. It escalated until the crew held an informal trial, presided over by a parrot who had picked up an unsettling talent for mimicry after being confined near the gunpowder room. The parrot shouted the verdict, hung for vanity, until someone remembered it was only 23 years old and likely quoting a previous captain's fate. The accused was let off with a warning and a complimentary brush. On land, the British government tried issuing a proclamation. The tone was stern and the calligraphy impressive, though unfortunately printed in Latin at a time when many sailors spoke mostly in grunts and horrifying songs about sea cucumbers. A well-meaning effort to raise a counterforce resulted in the mustering of 6 ships, one of which was accidentally beached in Norfolk due to a cartographer's romantic confusion over coastal silhouettes. The entire crew was reassigned to lighthouse maintenance, where they would cause no further embarrassment. The pirates eventually attracted the attention of one Captain Algernon Peckworth, a man known mostly for his deep mistrust of umbrellas and an extraordinary collection of inherited medals. He had a ship, a plan, and what he called an honour debt to the Navy. which turned out to involve surrendering a relative to an angry walrus in Portsmouth. Captain Peckworth insisted on hunting the pirate vessel down personally, even as his crew quietly suffered through motivational speeches that managed to rhyme valour with potato cellar. For morale, they flew 3 flags at once, one with a lion, one with a turnip, and one that simply read, "Yes, we mind." But the pirates had grown sneaky. They began disguising the warship as a whaling vessel, then as a Dutch cargo freighter, then as a floating puppet theatre offering Neapolitan tragedies to disoriented sailors. This disguise was surprisingly effective. One Royal Navy ship attempted to board with a warrant, only to find the footlights set, a papier-mâché Neptune on a stick, and a one-eyed crewman reciting lines from a fictional 6th century opera about betrayal and fermented cod. They backed away slowly. The Admiral wrote in his log that he would rather be sunk under God's waves than critique amateur theatre on his behalf. Eventually, an ambitious cleric in Dover announced that he had dreamed of the ship's doom after eating too many winter turnips. He began writing letters to the Navy, Parliament, and 3 foreign princes. By accident, one of his letters reached the pirates themselves, who found it flattering. In response, they sent back a single handkerchief, embroidered with an anatomical drawing of a ship's rudder and a cucumber. It was either a threat, a joke, or an inside reference no one remembered anymore. Experts later debated this at length, publishing papers with titles like "Embroidery as Maritime Menace." By now, the ship's original architect had retired to a small village in Devonshire and taken to carving model ships out of biscuit dough. He refused to speak about the vessel, other than to say he no longer trusted angles smaller than 70 degrees. When a curious schoolteacher pressed him for clues about its fate, he handed over the plans for a collapsible dinghy shaped like a marrow, and vowed never to design again unless bribed with aniseed. The village named a street after him regardless, perhaps out of pity or confounded respect. Back at sea, the pirates had begun arguing about retirement. One wanted to turn the warship into a floating museum. Another dreamed of converting it into a pie barge, as public appetite for mobile bakeries was famously strong after the meat shortage of 1629. Still another proposed opening a university at sea, offering degrees in nautical deception and advanced foppishness. No one agreed, but they did hold a council to settle it democratically. After 7 hours and 3 duels that no one aimed to win, they concluded that indecision was the safest course and decided to do all 3. The result was a warship that occasionally stopped raids to offer jam samples or lectures in Renaissance etiquette. At night, when the ocean was quiet and the sky thick with stars and unsorted regrets, the ship drifted almost peacefully. Its sails creaked like forgotten promises. The anchor chain clinked with a rhythm that, if you listened just right, sounded like it might resolve into a lullaby. Below deck, crewmen played cards with increasingly invented rules, while somewhere near the galley, the parrot loudly recited fragments of 7 separate manifestos, mixing ship procedure with overheard Dutch poetry. It was chaos, but it was very well organised chaos, and all the while Britain pretended it had never seen that particular ship before. Things took on an especially theatrical flair when the pirates, now in possession of this swanky British warship, began giving it absurdly formal names during their raids. They called it things like His Majesty's Mistake and the Floating Oops, even painting mock royal crests on the sails just subtle enough to be deniable. Harried English merchants would squint through spyglasses, wondering why the ship chasing them looked familiar, only to realise it was. It was the ship their taxes had helped build. Now it was flying a Jolly Roger, drawn suspiciously in the shape of a goose. To make matters more complex, the pirates started recruiting. Not in the traditional sense with ransom notes or press gangs, but by setting up what can only be described as a floating job fair. They anchored just off isolated coasts, inviting bored or underpaid sailors aboard with promises of regular meals, equal shares, and no lectures about God or Parliament. The pirates even had promotional pamphlets, handwritten of course, boasting pensions in rum and an official policy of no flogging unless someone really deserves it. By midsummer, their crew included 3 shipwrights, a disgraced bishop, and someone who claimed to have once punched a bear. Back in Britain, Parliament began to suspect that selling the warship to vaguely Mediterranean private traders might have been overly optimistic. Committees were formed. These committees had subcommittees, and those subcommittees passed the time by writing each other strongly worded letters blaming everyone else. At one point, a very senior official declared that the real problem wasn't piracy, but that the pirates had too keen a sense of irony. Absolutely no one knew what he meant. Naturally, he was promoted. Meanwhile, a town on the Cornish coast made headlines by narrowly fending off a pirate attack using nothing but sheep. They had too few weapons and too much wool, so they improvised. The specifics are lost to time, but we do know it involved tar, shouting, and one very confused livestock inspector. The pirates retreated not in defeat, but in what they described as philosophical disagreement with the town's concept of defence. They left behind a note scrawled in surprisingly elegant script, urging the mayor to consider writing a play instead. Just when the situation seemed improbably stable, a French noble tried to hire the pirate ship for a secret mission he refused to explain. He showed up in a velvet coat, 4 poodles, and a wagon full of fermented turnips. The pirates were intrigued. They invited him aboard for dinner, which they usually served with a side of sarcasm. After several days of indecisive bickering and a failed attempt to set up a duelling schedule by star sign, both parties agreed they disliked each other too much to engage in treason together. The noble left in a huff and reportedly tried to sue Neptune. At this point, the warship began developing something of a fan following. Children along the English coast started carving tiny replicas of it out of driftwood, while taverns began crafting cocktails named after its exploits, most of which involved gin, fire, and at least one regrettable shoe. There was even a travelling puppet show that reenacted the now famous Battle of the Contractual Misunderstanding, in which a Royal Navy escort accidentally saluted the pirate ship, assuming it was friendly, before being boarded, robbed, and politely handed a list of efficiency tips. One of the pirate officers, a former accountant named Gilbert, began publishing a quarterly gazette called the Floating Chronicle, which included raid schedules, personal musings on sailcloth management, and a crossword puzzle known to reduce grown men to tears. British intelligence tried to intercept it, but a surprising number of their agents became subscribers. One mariner even left the Navy, citing a preference for editorial standards on the high seas. Then came the incident with the floating bakery. No one had meant for it to happen. It all started when the pirates seized a coastal cargo of flour, yeast, and questionable raisins. One witty crewman said they ought to become bakers on the side, and within a week they had jury-rigged a chimney into the foredeck. They began baking dense, oddly spiced loaves, and offering them during raids as part of their hostile hospitality package. Several merchant captains reported being robbed and then offered warm bread while their sails were set on fire. One even asked for the recipe. By this point, the Crown was sending out increasingly contradictory orders. One fleet was told to destroy the pirate ship. Another was instructed to negotiate a license fee. A third was asked to steal it back stealthily, ideally during bad weather. All three failed. One ship ended up grounded after chasing a decoy, an inflatable raft painted to look like a decoy raft, which in turn had been modelled after a picture of the real ship drawn on a bedsheet. The Admiral later described it as a clever misrepresentation of vector-based deterrence. Again, he was promoted. And yet, despite their antics and accidental empire building, the pirates remained oddly principled. For instance, they never raided on Wednesdays, claiming it was bad luck, though some suspect it had more to do with their onboard poetry club holding meetings on that day. And they always returned whatever items they found distasteful, including powdered wigs, moral pamphlets, and once an entire set of porcelain dentures. These would be carefully boxed, labelled "No Thank You," and rowed back ashore with great ceremony. Among the newer recruits was a horn player from Venice, who had lost his orchestra job due to excessive theatrical flair. He began composing what he called piratic overtures, performed on moonlit nights as they drifted past imperial ports, entirely out of tune but unsettlingly catchy. Several governors reported vivid nightmares involving trumpets and unpaid bills. That winter, the House of Lords began debating whether fear induced by impromptu sea music constituted a naval threat. Of course, not everything went smoothly aboard the ship. Two of the senior pirates developed an intense and prolonged feud over the proper folding of navigational charts. This culminated in an official duel using cheese wheels, which turned out to be surprisingly violent. The matter was finally settled by a tie-breaking vote from the ship's goat, who expressed its decision by consuming the more boring chart in front of everyone. The winning pirate was named Navigation Officer, and later wrote a book that no one understood, even after several key terms were translated into Latin. The British public, weary of explanations, began referring to the whole situation as the floating embarrassment, a phrase which eventually made it into a folk song sung in pubs with verses added as events unfolded. The lyrics, charmingly inconsistent, sometimes praised the pirates as seafaring Robin Hoods, and sometimes blamed them for high prices, bad weather, and one particularly rude parrot. That parrot, incidentally, did actually exist. It had been trained to scream the names of underperforming naval officers, and was rumoured to have its own hammock. As spring returned, so too did the possibility of resolution, though not in the way anyone planned. But that, of course, is another part of the story, best saved for after a sip of tea, the closing of the shutters, and perhaps a word with that parrot, if it lets you get one in. The British authorities, bless them, spent the next several years chasing their own former warship around the Mediterranean, like a cat trying to discipline a runaway mouse it accidentally gave stilts to. The pirates, now in possession of what should have been the pride of the Royal Navy, wasted no time painting it black, hanging up laundry where the signal flags used to go, and renaming it something menacing like the Bloody Dagger, or, more likely, the reason the Admiralty drinks before noon. Out at sea, the ex-British vessel became a sort of maritime embarrassment. Every time it appeared on the horizon, British captains had to make a quick decision: engage, flee, or pretend not to notice, and suddenly become deeply interested in cloud shapes. Meanwhile, the pirates, mostly Barbary corsairs out of North Africa, developed a fondness for boarding English ships and dramatically announcing that they were reclaiming colonial interest payments. It became, in all fairness, rather stylish in a horribly ironic way. Occasionally, English diplomats would suggest maybe buying the ship back. This was attempted at least twice, but negotiations tended to fall apart shortly after the phrase "we forgot it had cannons" came up. The pirates were, unsurprisingly, not interested in giving back their free battleship. Instead, they doubled down, employing it to escort their other vessels as if it were a grumpy chaperone at a school dance who also knew how to broadside your treasurer. One English officer, upon seeing his former command rolling cheerfully into harbour under a skull and crossbones flag, reportedly muttered something fierce and unprintable about budget cuts before taking up gardening. All across the empire the story spread. Britain's own warship was now the best pirate ship money could not buy, because some accountant in Whitehall had decided it was more cost-effective to lose at sea than win while over budget. Of course, as time went on, the edges of the story began to fray. The pirates passed the ship from one allied group to another, sometimes as a trade, other times as a friendly loan, and once in a high-stakes game of backgammon. That last one may have been exaggerated, but only slightly. Eventually no one could quite remember who exactly held the title deed, but everyone agreed it definitely was not Britain. By the late 1620s the ship became both worse and better than myth. It had changed hands often enough to get patched and repatched in at least 3 different architectural styles. French chroniclers claimed it had secret compartments. Spanish spies swore it had sails made from redecorated monk robes. One Ottoman observer drew diagrams implying the ship could levitate in warm weather, which, to be fair, may have just been an artistic misunderstanding of steam rising off the deck. Its long wooden shadow spread further than anyone expected. Sailors would whisper about the ship that sailed itself, the floating betrayal, or, in one particularly bitter pub in Plymouth, that bloody thing. No one could really sink it, catch it, buy it back, or even afford to politely ignore it. It became the maritime version of a family heirloom you regret pawning, now being shown off by your neighbour with smugness you can see from space. And yet, as with all terribly overworked things, the ship eventually began to creak in ways no manner of hull patches or pirate enthusiasm could fix. The rigging sagged. The figurehead's face wore the expression of someone perpetually whispering, "Help me," and even the cannonballs started rolling hesitant little circles rather than charging out with proper menace. When it finally ran aground somewhere off the Greek coast, depending on which map or poem you believe, it was not with a dramatic crash, but more of a sound like an old man easing into a creaky chair. The pirates, by then a patchwork gang of opportunists, scholars, former monks, and one alleged Venetian opera singer, stepped off the ship quietly and wandered into the nearest village to look for figs and possibly a new excuse. British officials were informed eventually. There's a letter in the archives declaring the ship's demise with less grief and more passive-aggressive relief, like someone announcing that the world's worst houseguest finally fell down a well. The statement reads with all the emotional weight of someone declaring their allergies cured because the cat ran away. And so, this mighty warship, designed to represent the cutting edge of naval dominance, ended its life mostly made of borrowed timber, flying a flag that had been used as a curtain until the mice claimed it. Its name was long forgotten, replaced by nicknames shouted across oceans and muttered in foreign courts. There are some who claim pieces of it were repurposed into a tavern door in Crete, a few planks into a chicken coop in Marseille. Mostly, though, it drifted out of history not with a bang, but with the sigh of unpaid debts and poorly thought-through yard sales. Today no one remembers the original launch ceremony, with its royal ribbons and proud speeches, but more than a few weather-beaten sailors still recall seeing it out on the water, still patched, still improbably afloat, still hurling cannonballs made by the same nation that received them with surprise. And so we leave it there. A ship that should have been a symbol of empire instead turned into floating proof that you really ought to check the buyer's references. A cautionary tale made of oak and irony. Somewhere, perhaps deep below the waters off a quiet Greek island, a barnacle-covered beam still creaks with the memory of royal disapproval. And on particularly quiet nights, if you listen closely, you might hear the sound of a distant pirate coughing politely, asking if the Admiralty would like their embarrassment back, gift-wrapped with ribbon, and maybe a dead seagull for effect.